So let's say you're already aware. You're aware that you're about to die in a few minutes or a few hours, or you're about to get sedated into oblivion, and you're not going to physically die yet, but as far as you're concerned, that's the end of your consciousness and awareness. You're not going to be aware or conscious when your body actually dies. The end of your consciousness. So that's actually one definition of one criteria for dying, right? What is death to you? And why is it very stressful for some people, for a lot of people? A lot of people will say, well, your body dies. Your heart stops, your lungs stop, and your organs stop, and then, it's already dead. So they kind of preserve you, embalming. People can look at your body, but you're dead already. You don't think you're alive when you're lying down there, and people are looking at your body. And in some societies, they still burn the body. You don't think you're alive while they're burning your body, right? Cremation. In the olden days, they put you on this, the Vikings and stuff. So your body shut down. So that's one. Physical death, right? Biological death. Your organs die, and then suddenly the entire thing dies. Now, of course, you can ask a lot of questions as far as that is concerned. What if you replace the organs? Like, suddenly it's a mechanical kidney or a mechanical heart, a mechanical brain. Of course, that makes things really complicated. Like, what about consciousness? Can you actually do that? And we won't go there. For one thing, I'm not familiar with artificial intelligence or transferring one's consciousness into a supercomputer. I don't think we have that kind of computer yet. I think we'll take lots and lots and lots of science to get there, if we can actually get there. But when you ask an ordinary person right now, the body dies, you die. But what else do you lose? What else is gone? Well, if your body dies, then you don't move, right? You don't live. What do you mean? When your body dies, you don't move, you don't live. Well, you don't enjoy your house, you don't enjoy your car. So you lose your body and you lose everything you worked hard for. For many people, that won't matter much, especially if they're about to die. They might even be willing to give away all of their riches so that they live, right? Of course, not everyone will do that, but majority, I guess, will do that. Because what's the point of having all these things if you're not alive? What's the point of having all these things if you cannot enjoy them? You'd rather live than have all these things, right? So you lose your stuff. But that's not the most important thing. A very important thing is you don't just lose your stuff. You don't get to talk to your family members, your kids, your spouse, your loved ones, people closest to you. That stops. You cannot interact with them anymore. You can't speak. You can't hear them. You can't talk to them. So you lose relationships. You lose others. Now that's a big deal. On multiple surveys, when people get asked, what are you most afraid of? Or what are you most afraid of losing? What will you worry about? If the survey is on actual dying people, what are you most worried about? Way up there in the list. Sometimes number one, sometimes in the top 2 or the top 3 would be relations. I worry about my family. I worry about my kids, It's okay. I accept my death, but I cannot accept it right now in the sense that I worry about my kids. Anxiety, not directed at self, but directed at the loved ones. Because you lose contact with them. You cannot protect them anymore. You cannot interact with them anymore. So if they're so worried about their family member, that means they value the relationship. So that's a big loss. Now, when they say, I just want to make sure that they're okay, that's a sacrificing, heroic thing, It's okay. I'm willing to die as long as I'm guaranteed that they'll be okay. Of course, the question is, will they be okay? So the take-home point usually is for the family members not to introduce all sorts of things to make the patient feel like everyone will experience hardship and suffering and things like that when they die. That would make it terribly hard for the patient who loves all of them to accept death, right? Now, they don't want to die because everyone will suffer, or there's going to be a lot of conflicts, and there's going to be a lot of hardship. So you try not to make them feel that way. You try to deliver a message that it's okay, don't worry about us, we'll be fine. A dying parent with a small kid, will want to make sure their small kid will be well taken care of. But then if you really think about it, when you ask someone, what is life? I mean, how do you define it? Because if they define it, that's what they're going to lose. Death is the opposite of life. When you die, you lose life, right? That's the end of life. Death is loss of life, right? So what is life? And people will start telling you, life is like eating, being with family members, enjoying my life, doing what I want to do, achieving my goal, working so that I can achieve my goal. And they'll say all sorts of stuff. But if you really try to condense it in one description, it's experiencing life. You're aware, you're conscious, you're experiencing life. So that's what you're going to lose, right? So the experience of life. So the idea that you won't experience anything anymore. You won't be aware and conscious enough to experience anything anymore. Or you won't be aware, you won't be conscious, and therefore you won't experience anything anymore. You'll be dead, right? For most people, that's the most significant loss there is. That's the biggest loss there is. You stop experiencing anything. You cease to exist. Or if you exist, you're some kind of an entity that doesn't experience anything. Like a statue somewhere. That's not even you, right? So that's the most traumatic thing, ceasing to exist, right? So how do people approach that? Well, you approach that depending on your belief system, on what you think about life and what you think about death. That's the reason why I'm encouraging you to look at the first 2 sessions, because this one is becoming very existential, philosophical, and things like that. But although I'm trying not to, just make it really down to earth and practical. As much as we can. We're talking about death and life. It's somewhat hard to do. It depends on what you think about life and death. That's pretty much what it is. And what's your life narrative? What gives your life meaning? What gives everything meaning? Life and death. What's your philosophy about the world, about existence? What's your religious belief? Do you have a religious belief? What's your personal spiritual belief? Do you believe that you have a spirit? Things like that. That would come into play, right? The question is, are you going to transcend death? That's transcending death. Of course, some people, don't really bother about transcending death. Don't really care much about it. But most people would think about transcending death. Even the atheist, most atheists would want to transcend death in some way. Transcending death. Something beyond death. Last few minutes, you die. And pretty much what happens to you now is just a straight course towards death. Or a straight course towards non-consciousness. They sedate you, and that's pretty much it. And you wake up somewhere, or that's it. You won't wake up, period. It's almost like an early death. We preempted your death. Pretty sure some of the priests and pastors would have something to say about that, especially if we start doing it all over the place. Everyone who's dying, who looks like they're grimacing, and the family members are uncomfortable, and they want you peaceful and calm sleeping, everybody gets forced into a coma so that everybody has a more peaceful time. The question is, do you want that? We took out your suffering right before death. Did we take out something else aside from that? The pastor or priest would also say, if you believe that there's something, that you have to work for something, like an afterlife or heaven, or God's kingdom, then don't do all sorts of things and just say that, you'll just try to do some good thing or say some magic belief statement once you're about to die, because who knows, it might sedate you and you won't be able to say it, right? Priests and pastors would say, even if you say the statement, that's not actually what really counts. What really counts is the condition of your heart. You cannot lie. If there's really God, you cannot lie to God. He can see right through you, right? You've hardened your heart too much. Anyway, that's, this is not religion. I'll stop there. Okay, so that's Judeo-Christian belief. I'm pretty sure other belief systems and other religions would have other ideas, maybe similar, maybe dissimilar ideas. So now, transcending death. Well, death is okay because I can transcend it. That's the idea. That's the thing that will guide you before you lose consciousness or before you die. Well, what do you mean by transcending? What are you okay with? Existing beyond death. Well, one is in the memories of everyone. Live in the memories of my kids and my grandkids and my grandchildren and the people I've interacted with. So, memory of you. As long as people remember you and think about you, your spirit lives. And it's actually a very common idea. You exist while people believe that you exist, and then you stop existing. So it's not like an unusual thing. The thought that I exist, I'll exist in the minds of in the memories of my relatives or my loved ones. There's oral traditions that would be an oral tradition. Those kinds of belief systems that could be an oral tradition. It could be like you're a famous person and they teach you in class, like, this is our national hero, or this is like a very smart doctor in our country, and brought in this field of whatever, or became the president of this academy or society, or became the dean. Buildings named after you, or your pictures on the walls, and if you're great enough, you might even have your head, like your bust in a few places, or a statue of you erected, maybe. We put too much into that. Like, how many of you go into your college and look at the pictures and look at the picture of a dean like a few decades ago, and say, well, that's the name and that's the face, and you'd want to know more about that person. How many of you would want to do that? Well, very, very few. It's even possible in one entire medicine class of 200, nobody would even care. That's the dean, that's the face, and that's pretty much it. Or a building, it's named after some guy with his surname. And why? We don't know. Well, he was supposed to do this, like 2 sentences. That's the only memory you have. The only memory you'll get. Now, of course, I think the whole point for you guys is probably that's not a good thing to work for. Don't assume too much. I mean, you're not an Einstein. Even the memory of Einstein won't last too long. Imagine how many students would remember the scientists of the 1940s, 1950s, and 1960s, 100 years from now, probably fewer. And how much will they remember? Okay, so oral tradition. In the olden, and this goes back a long way. It's not just, we teach people in school. That's like the modern version. And the older version is like, people gather around in their tribe, around the bonfire, around the fire, and then the elders start talking about the history of their clan. Like, this person did this, and it's a very old tradition, and we live in those narratives. Nowadays, westernized or modern societies, we don't care. It's actually more self-focused. Be happy what you can do for yourself. If you want to figure out what your great-great-grandparents did, that's fine, but most of the time you don't care, right? People sometimes think that way. If they don't think afterlife and they want transcendence, then that's the transcendence they'll work for, right? So that's the kind of transcendence or immortality that they'll work for, right? But for a lot of people, what they're really after is immortality of self-awareness. That means you can still get to experience stuff. You're still self-aware. You don't care about your name on the wall, or your statue, or your picture on the wall, or name on the textbook. I mean, who cares, right? What they really want is they still want to exist. They want to be self-aware. They want to experience. Okay, so that's the kind of transcendence they're aiming for. Now, how can you do that if your body's already dead? Actually, when like several decades from now, your body is decomposing. The brain there is not functional. You probably don't want to be self-aware while you're inhabiting that kind of body. You probably want to have a better body that's not like that, right? But when people want transcendence or immortality, they're thinking that way. Continuation of experiencing. So that's the kind of continuation of life they want. Now, there's only one problem with this. If you don't have a body, that means you're aiming for something that would continue to exist without a body. And now you can go into all sorts of places. Like, if it's religion, that's spiritual immortality. So first of all, you have to believe that there's such a thing as a spirit. And the spirit will become immortal, an eternal spirit. And how can you be eternal? Well, you have to be attached to something that's eternal, like God, for example, in the Christian or Catholic belief. Right now, as we progress, westernized and modern societies, there's less and less and less belief about God and heaven and the kingdom of God and afterlife and things like that. Even the other religious beliefs, which would have some form of immortality, you get reincarnated continuously, as the westernized mindset or the modern scientific mindset sets in, then there'll be less and less belief that those things actually happen. Now, if we're talking about this person lying down in front of you who's about to die, we're not talking about future, like several decades from now. We're talking about now. This person will most likely think that way. So, but it's now having doubts. So that's a spiritual distress. And there's a really good chance that in that hospital, nobody's there to help him sort out his existential distress. Unless somebody calls up the priest or the pastor, like their family member or the doctors, think it's important enough to call the priest or the pastor. Now, the problem is the very scientific medical or healthcare staff increasingly don't do that. There's all sorts of reasons. First of all, they probably don't think it's that important. You think about priest and pastor only when the patient's about to die, so that they can do whatever stuff they do so that the patient thinks he'll go to heaven. The question is, does the doctor think there's actually a heaven or not? It might not even matter, because you're just concerned about your patient's well-being. But if you're really concerned about your patient's well-being, this kind of spiritual and existential distress could have been much less if you involved the priest or the pastor or the pastoral care provider, the spiritual counselor, earlier on. Except that we don't do that. Some people think it's not that important, and the other reason is they might just interfere with what you're doing. Now, our current case makes things really, really difficult because it's COVID ward. Every time you go in there, you have to wear PPEs and all sorts of stuff. Who do you allow? Some institutions would allow the pastoral care provider or the spiritual counselor or the priest or the pastor because they think it's really important, at least as far as this person is concerned. But many institutions won't. Right now, you can even guess the situation in the hospitals in many places, right? So, because the society itself or the governments themselves look at churches and places of religious worship to strengthen you spiritually, to address your spiritual distress in these times of crisis. And they just look at them and they classify them like, like a theater or a cinema or a concert, right? The restrictions on cinemas and places of entertainment where you hear concert, like, famous singer. In their mind, that's the same restriction will apply when people go to church and listen to the priest to commune with God. And the argument is you can do that in your home. And it's not that important to gather. Who did you ask, right? There's a problem. There's something wrong with the way it's being treated right now. And if the society thinks of it that way, then how would most hospitals think of it? Same thing. It's not that important. You can just put a tablet in there and the pastor and the priest can do the 5-minute thing, and that's pretty much all there is to it. The feeding tube and the NG tube and the pulse ox and the blood pressure is much more important than that. We change PPEs and monitor the patient even if he's dying until the last second doing that. Obviously, based on our behavior, it looks like we feel like those needle sticks and vital signs monitoring and doctors rounding on a dying patient, even if they cannot do anything anymore, it's much more important than a priest or a pastor passing by to address this person's spiritual distress or questions or concerns. Probably traumatizing them right now, right? The closer you are to death, the more relational, emotional, and spiritual your problems are. And like I said before, sometimes you're even happy that you're feeling some degree of pain and discomfort, because the less pain you feel, the closer you are to death, especially if you know that you're about to die in the next few days, right? Feeling something, even if it's a discomfort, reminds you or tells you that you're still alive. And this would be a good thing for people who really fear death, right? Transcendence. Now, of course, you can do all sorts of metaphysical, Eastern religion or science-based idea of consciousness. Your consciousness is actually a form of energy, and you go into this quantum field of energy, so you exist I would guess some people actually believe that, especially the more scientifically inclined. Some of them will think that way. Definitely not most. We won't go into that. Now, just to be fair, the Christian and Catholic beliefs are not the only thing. There's other stuff. We've talked about spirits existing as long as people remember them. And there's also such a thing as being in spirit, but you're not aware. If you lose your self-awareness. So you achieve this state of spiritual immortality, but you're not aware. You join this undefinable, immeasurable place where spirits go, but you lose your self-awareness, but you're immortal, whatever that means. You lose your sense of self, but you're there in spirit. And then, of course, the non-religious, there's lots of non-religious things. I mean, it's possible for people who don't believe in those to die peacefully. You don't transcend anything, but you die peacefully without a lot of distress and suffering. Interestingly, remember when we talked about in the previous, or the second session, Elizabeth Kubler-Ross, the one who interviewed a lot of dying people and came up with this DABDA, denial, anger, bargaining, depression, acceptance, that one. And acceptance is the main goal. There's all sorts of questions about DABDA. There's misperceptions about, we won't tackle that right now, but we probably would have to soon, just to clarify that thing. It's very helpful, but it caused a lot of confusion. She interviewed a lot of dying people, and she was asked, what do you see? I mean, what kind of people who die peacefully? Probably the religious ones, because they know they're going somewhere and they're not scared of death. And her answer is kind of interesting. She said, yes, if the person really believes that they're going to some place better, and this life here is only transient, it's nowhere near where they're heading, or they're self-aware. If it's the Christian or Judeo-Christian or Catholic belief, it's like the kingdom of God, they'll be with God, all goodness and all peace and happiness and all sorts of all those things, then they die peacefully. Why would you not, right? If you really strongly believe that. But then, that's not the great majority. Just because you go to church and you have that belief system, it doesn't automatically make you die peacefully. Why? Because in that belief system, not everyone goes there, right? Some people don't go there. And depending on how you interpret the scriptures, or depending on how your particular church or religion interprets the scriptures, you might end up in a place that's really, really bad, filled with suffering and pain. Now you're scared. And you don't know, you're not sure. Do you go to the good place or the bad place? And if people are not sure, they don't have that conviction that they would be going to the good place, then they don't die in peace. There's actually a lot of death anxiety and fear of death related to that. Now, even people who are not near death might be anxious or fearful about that. That's the reason why some of the philosophers of the 20th century ended up attacking Christian or Catholic beliefs. They say, they're causing a lot of fear and anxiety. People are just focused on that, and they'll get punished, and they'll be made to suffer because they're not good, they're sinful, and things like that. And so they came up with the idea that, we have to replace it with something better. Something that upholds living life here and now, being happy and achieving your full potential as a human being. Why think about God and heaven and things like that? So drag down the Judeo-Christian, and Catholic religions and belief systems in modern times. It's one of the main things that triggered, or that gave people a way to drag that belief system down. But the other reason is, it's wrong. There's no equality. Puts women here, and it's wrong. So it's not the end thing right now. I don't know where we're going to end up in, but I don't think it's going to be a good thing. That's not what this talk is all about. But surprisingly, the atheists, a small group of atheists, seems to die peacefully also. Meaning, of course, she can't really tell. I mean, she can't enter their brains. Right? When she asks them and tries to figure them out, they say they're accepting and they're peaceful. And these are atheists. They don't believe in God. They don't believe in the afterlife. They don't believe in heaven. I mean, this is like 1960s America, very religious, very Christian, but they don't believe that. These are the atheists, and they're okay with that. So I guess it's the uncertainty that's bugging people. If you're not really sure what will happen to you, the uncertainty can destroy your peace. These atheists know for sure in their entire life that this is what gives. They disappear, and that's the end of the story, and they're happy with that. They'll probably be saying, well, at least my kids will remember me, and think of all sorts of other things, but they don't believe in heaven or the afterlife. And they seem to be peaceful every time she asks them. Now, a lot of them will say, would still try to grab at something, like some transcendence, like, think that their kids will remember them. At least he'll live in his grandchildren, and that's biological immortality. Great-grandchildren is part of that. In a way, they try to transcend things. Or some would even say, go to the beach and scatter my ashes along the coast, because, the sea is a symbol for me for this and that. And of course, if you really think you're just a physical body that's already dead, I mean, why would you care, right? So people still are trying to reach for something, even if they don't believe in God or the afterlife. Something that would make them feel more accepting of death, right? Of course, that is if you're really an atheist. Of course, we're not talking about the other kinds of atheists or the other kinds of non-religious non-believers. Like, you're in the university, and you gather around, you don't think you're going to die, and that's farthest from your mind. You're young, you can actually die, you just don't think about it. And then, you go out, you drink with your friends, and you tell each other, you don't believe in religion and things like that, and you talk about what would be considered by, let's say you're in a society that's predominantly Christian or Catholic, what would be considered by the Christian or Catholic belief system as immoral and unethical, but you don't believe that, and it's pleasurable and it's happy, and you can brag to each other, about your unbelief and about your immoral or unethical conquest. But of course, making fun of the traditional conservative people who are believing a lie and things like that. So, and you do that, and then life is fun. There's no rules. There's no absolutes, and as far as you're doing, there's nothing wrong with that. And more of you are doing the same thing. So, but then deep inside you, when you were small, when you're growing up, you actually got exposed to your core foundational belief is actually Christian and Catholic. You're just coming up with rationalizations and justifications for a life that's more fun and pleasurable. Now, we're not referring to that kind of person, because that kind of person will really have a hard time near death if he doesn't resolve that, right? Because that's not his actual belief. So it only works while he's living. Now that he's in bed and his body's not functional, there's no fun, no pleasure, no happiness, and suddenly you're just going to go into non-existence. Then the thing that's inside of them, core belief system, not the superficial justifications for bad behavior and for fun bantering with buddies, I mean, those disappear, right? Now you're worried about whether you actually exist or not. So that's not a complete atheist. Because if you truly are, you won't care. That's what happens to everyone. You're a body, you shut down, and then you go. But you're not like that. You only made yourself believe that you're like that. Now you're close to death. And suddenly the real you inside of you comes out. And now you're in trouble, right? Something to think about. If you're young, you probably should go for the right meanings in life, and you probably should aim for the right goals in life, because death is the end of life. And once you're close to death, then you start questioning what your life is all about. And the amount of suffering and distress, your reaction to death would depend on, to a certain degree, on what you thought your life was, how you lived your life, right? will probably end there.